Hello and welcome to your lecture on research methods in comparative politics. In this video, you'll take a crash course in the research methods used by political scientists and other social scientists to try and explain the world around us. Now, some of this research methodology stuff can seem pretty dry, but we expose you to this information because it's extremely important to have a basic understanding of these methods. First, it's integral to understanding how science works in any discipline. Second, and more importantly, it's key to understanding how to make and critique arguments. Now, learning how to logically make and critique arguments will make you a better student, writer, and speaker. So without further ado, let's get started on our research methods lecture, or as Derek Zoolander might say, tools for kids who want to do political science good and other sciences good too. So research methods are basically tools for answering a question. And asking a good question is key to making scientific progress. With a clearly stated research question, a scientist can begin the process of rigorously applying the scientific method to create knowledge and answer the question in a transparent way to avoid bias. So let's take a question we'll think a great deal about in this course. Why are some countries democracies while other countries are not? Here's a map of the world's regime type. As determined by Freedom House, which is a nonprofit that does a lot of research in determining who is a democracy, who is not a democracy, and who's in between. And here in green, you can see these are countries that Freedom House has rated as free democracies. In the sort of gray purplish, those are countries that are authoritarian, and the yellow countries fall somewhere in between. So our question is basically trying to explain why these different countries have these colors. Why are some democracies? Why are some autocracies? Why are some in the middle? Once we have our question, the next step is to form a theory. A theory is an abstract argument that provides a systematic explanation of some phenomenon. In other words, it's a proposed answer to a question about the world. Broadly speaking, there are two types of theory. An empirical theory is an argument about what is, so it explains what actually occurs. Now, an empirical theory is best when it not only explains what happened, but helps us predict what will happen in the future. So to answer our question concerning democracy, an ideal empirical theory would explain where democracy is today, and also to help us predict where democracy will develop in the future. A normative theory is an argument that explains what ought to occur, or what ought to be. A normative theory might tell us all of the ways that democracy is the best type of political regime, and how an ideal democracy ought to look. This normative theory, as well as most other normative theories, falls more within the realm of political theory than in comparative politics. So the goal of comparative politics is mainly to generate and test empirical theories. Understanding normative theories is very important as they help us explain political behavior. But we do aspire to provide objective knowledge, and this is the realm of empirical theories. So, going back to our question, let's take a major empirical theory from comparative politics to explain where democracy does and does not emerge. One theory, called the Modernization theory, maintains that democracy occurs in economically prosperous, modernized societies. And indeed, if you look at the map, rich areas like North America and Europe are completely green, meaning completely democratic. So this is our theory. Wealth leads to democracy. With our theory in hand, the next step is testing hypotheses. A hypothesis is an argument linking cause to effect, and a useful hypothesis is always grounded in a theory that explains the relevant aspects of the world. So our hypothesis, the modernization hypothesis, which is grounded in modernization theory, is that economic wealth is the cause of democratization, the effect. So in thinking about theories and hypotheses, we'll use the term variable. A variable is a measurable phenomenon that changes or varies across time and space. Generally, these are attributes of some person or object, so democracy as an attribute of a country, or wealth as an attribute of an economy. So in thinking about variables, we're going to concern ourselves with two kinds of primary variables. Those are independent variables and dependent variables. So the dependent variable is what a scientist is trying to explain, while the independent variable is what is meant to explain the dependent variable. So the independent variables are the causes of the dependent variables, which are the effects. Here, of course, our independent variable is wealth, and our dependent variable is democracy. One way to remember these names is just to think about how the dependent variable depends upon the independent variable for its values. So if our hypothesis is correct, as wealth goes up, the probability of democratization should go up. And the independent variable, however, doesn't depend on anything. Wealth is sort of what is generated by the world and that is what then in turn will explain democratization. So what makes for a good theory and a good hypothesis? There are three primary attributes which we're going to talk about here. First is that it's testable. So we can actually go out into the world and collect real data to shed light on whether our hypothesis is correct. A big part of being testable is being falsifiable, meaning that we could actually collect data that would show our hypothesis to be incorrect. If a hypothesis cannot be proven wrong, or if a researcher can always rationalize any findings as supportive of that hypothesis, we aren't really learning anything about the world and we're not really making scientific progress. So this means that matters of opinion or faith are not testable hypotheses. That's not to say that they are wrong, it just means that we could never prove them to be incorrect, so we can't test them with the scientific method. And finally, we want our hypothesis tests to be replicable. A hypothesis shown to be true in one situation helps a bit, but we're really accumulating knowledge scientifically when that hypothesis is tested in diverse circumstances and conditions. This is one of the strengths of comparative politics. We might start by testing a theory in Italy, move to other comparable European countries, and then move to other developed countries around the world. However, testing theories in political science and other social sciences is often a difficult task. The ideal way to test a hypothesis is with a controlled laboratory experiment. Here you start with identical units and you randomly assign them different treatments of the independent variable to observe changes in the dependent variable. By holding everything else equal, a scientist conducting such an experiment knows that the factor she changes is the cause of any differences she observes, because every other factor is exactly the same. But we obviously can't get this perfect control in social science. For instance, in trying to determine whether economic development leads to democracy, we can't start with a bunch of identical countries and then randomly assign some countries to be wealthy and others to be poor, and then wait to see which develop democracies. Even if some fool gave political scientists this ridiculous power, most political scientists wouldn't do this kind of stuff, hopefully. Thus, we will typically rely on other ways to test our theories, and generally this will involve correlations. So you've probably heard the old adage that correlation does not equal causation, but it is worth very briefly thinking about. Here we see the correlation between economic development and democracy, and it is the case that richer countries tend to be democratic. Therefore, we might conclude that wealth does cause democracy. Correlation suggests that changes in the two variables seem reliably linked. However, it doesn't mean that the change in the hypothesized independent variable, for us, economic development, causes change in our dependent variable, democracy. Remember, causation means one variable actually leads to another variable. Correlation is a nice hint that this is going on, but alone it is insufficient. Indeed, the relationship between two correlated variables may often be spurious. If a relationship is spurious, it may seem to be causal, but it is not. This is often because there is some sneaky, unobserved third variable that is explaining the correlation. This is called omitted variable bias. For instance, it may be the case that economic development and democracy are correlated because a third omitted variable causes both of them. For example, some scholars have suggested that certain historical and colonial legacies lead to both economic prosperity and democracy, while others lead both to economic problems and autocracy. Another reason that correlation does not prove causation is the problem of reverse causation. And this is basically the problem of the relationship being exactly the opposite of what we expect. So instead of the independent variable leading to the dependent variable is actually leading to the independent variable. So for us, that means instead of economic development causing democracy, democracy is actually causing economic prosperity. We try to get around these factors by controlling for them. Control means that in looking at the correlation between two variables, a researcher also takes other factors into account. There are a few ways to do this. Many political scientists rely on statistical techniques and complex calculations to estimate the correlations of many variables simultaneously. Here is an example of a regression looking at our exact problem, the relationship between economic development and democracy. This is a pretty famous article in political science by scholars named Bosch and Stokes. And as you can see, there are a lot of numbers involved, and these numbers are meant to tease out the real relationship not only between economic development and democracy, but between variables with a lot of other variables included. So we can say that we have the real relationship between economic development and democracy. So this is an example of quantitative methods. And when you think quantitative methods, think quantity or numbers, because that is what is important for these methods. Quantitative data consists of numbers that researchers analyze, generally using quite sophisticated statistical techniques that take advantage of the immense data crunching power of computers. It's advantageous in that quantitative methods tend to look at many cases. And what this means is that usually the conclusions about the relationships between variables that they find are quite generalizable, meaning that you find them in so many cases, you can make an argument that this is a pretty generalizable phenomenon in the political world. Many other political scientists use a qualitative approach that takes a more fine-grained look at fewer cases. This provides an in-depth understanding of the variables in the hypothesis. Qualitative data includes things like interpretations of records, letters, and articles, in-depth interviews, or focus groups. Using these methods, researchers can trace causal processes. The disadvantage is that these methods usually hone in on one case or a few cases in great detail, so it might be questionable how generalizable the findings are. What may prove crucial in one case might be irrelevant to another. So that's a brief overview of qualitative and quantitative methods. Now, there are many proponents of both in the social sciences, but because there are so many tricky problems associated with testing social science theories, a growing number of social scientists work to combine these approaches. This is the idea of mixed methods research, where you might employ elements of both qualitative and quantitative research methods to take advantage of the unique insights of both to answer a question. So let's think about this with an example. Here is a map of North Korea and South Korea at night. South Korea, down there at the bottom, lit up really bright. We know it's economically developed, rich, also democratic. North Korea, up there on the top, you can see, is very dark. It's obviously economically very poor and of strong autocracy. So here's our question. Why is South Korea economically developed and democratic, while North Korea is neither? So a scholar interested in explaining why South Korea democratized might employ quantitative data on its economic and social structures, as well as quantitative survey data on public opinion in South Korea. But they might also rely upon qualitative data, such as in-depth interviews with regional experts and people who lived through the country's transition from autocracy to democracy. This is all helpful because, in general, the more ways you attack a problem and get the same answer, the more faith you can place in that answer. And finally, one favored method in comparative politics is the comparative method. So this is a pair of approaches, really, that we got from John Stuart Mill, and that compare cases in different ways to try and approximate laboratory control. So the first is the method of agreement. And here we'll test our theory by looking at cases that have different attributes but have the same outcome. So we look at cases that are very different but have the same sort of outcome that we're interested in, the same dependent variable. And we conclude that whatever these cases have in common, if there's one independent variable that they all have in common, that's what causes the dependent variable. Another way to look at this is the method of difference. Here we look at cases that have the same attributes but have different outcomes. So we look at cases that look like they should have lots of similar background, but they have different values in our dependent variable. Therefore, whatever one variable, whatever one attribute is different, that must be what explains variation in our dependent variable. So for an example of the method of agreement, when we're trying to think of why South Korea is democratic, we would look at countries that are very different from South Korea, but have the same sort of outcomes. So countries on different continents, with different economies, with different histories, with different cultures, like Thailand, Brazil, and Uruguay, who all democratized around the same time as South Korea in the 1980s. Whatever factor that is common to all of these cases must be what caused democratization. Or we might look at this problem using the method of difference. Here we would compare it to a case that is really similar to it in a lot of ways. So let's say North Korea. They have many obvious similarities. They have similar histories, cultures, languages, of course. And we would conclude that whatever one factor is different between North Korea and South Korea, well, that must be what explains democracy or the lack of democracy. These are very tried and true methods in comparative politics, and often it's best to try and use both. So you would look at both cases that are different and cases that are similar, and hopefully find the one variable that seems to work in both cases. So to conclude, our final thoughts on causality and comparative politics. Remember that it's best to combine multiple approaches and hope that they all point to the same process. This is what we discussed earlier with mixed methods research. So combining qualitative and quantitative approaches, using both the method of agreement and the method of difference. The more approaches you tackle a problem with and get the same answer, the more faith you can have in that answer. And that's something that we're going to remember as we look at a lot of competing theories and explanations in comparative politics. Where perhaps only one study seems to work out, or perhaps where an explanation only works in one errant case, we don't want to place too much faith in that explanation. But where we see evidence of a hypothesis in many different circumstances, over time, over different places, and using different methods, we can certainly place more faith in that explanation. Another key way we'll evaluate claims of causality in comparative politics is by thinking about the strength of the theory from which the hypothesis was created. Where the theory logically explains why the correlation between the dependent variable and the independent variable should be causal, we do have more reason to believe that it is. Of course, this is not proof. Another way to think about this is that a good theory should have some causal mechanisms at work. Causal mechanisms are these variables or processes that link the changes in the independent variable to the changes in the dependent variable. So they're basically the explanation. So an example of this with our modernization hypothesis is that a lot of the theorists in the modernization hypothesis have provided potential causal mechanisms linking economic prosperity to democratization. For instance, they have argued that such prosperity increases personal income, education levels, and the strength of urban centers, all of which make citizens more powerful in relation to their government and gives them the tools they need to get together, to associate, to form movements, and to put pressure on their political leaders and demand political rights. Finally, let's wrap up by considering a few more challenges we face in answering comparative politics questions scientifically. We have already considered one of the biggest problems, that we do not have laboratory conditions and therefore have a great deal of trouble isolating causation. Another problem is the difficulty of conceptualizing many of the things we are interested in. Remember, to use the scientific method, we need to have really good definitions of our concepts. But a lot of our concepts in comparative politics and in social science generally are quite slippery. So what if we're interested in representation and the quality of representation? What exactly is that? How do we define high quality or low quality representation? How do we know that when we see it? It's a term that gets used a lot and in many different ways, but it's challenging to incorporate it into a scientific hypothesis test. A related problem is measurement problems. How do we accurately measure these slippery constructs? Whereas physicists can often get very precise measurements, we'll spend a lot of our time in comparative politics and in social science trying to figure out how to measure things and arguing about those measures. How do we get data that actually reliably measures what we want to? The real world is full of misleading and ambiguous information, and we have to really weed through that. And of course, dealing with the real world is tricky as well because it changes. We're shooting at moving targets in the social science because the real political world changes every day. Scientific progress is a slow process, but surprising changes happen in the real world every day. There were a whole bunch of prominent political scientists talking about how stable Egypt's authoritarian regime was under Mubarak, and then it fell in a month. This same was true to a much greater extent when you think about the scholarly community before the Soviet Union fell and the Berlin Wall's fall. Lots of people were talking about how stable those systems were, how they'd be able to adapt and change with the times. And finally, a final challenge is, as we've mentioned before, we are dealing with people. And people are tricky to study because they can be awfully unpredictable and because they can lie to you and they can adapt to whatever you're saying to them. However, not all is lost, and despite these many challenges, social scientists have unveiled a lot of interesting facts about the world. Now that you are experts in the fundamentals of social science research methods and have a grasp of the way comparative politics works, you're ready to dive into the subject matter. Have fun!
Facts versus romance. You go.